Hello again. As you know, I am Eli, the computer guy, here to provide you gatekeeperless, authorityless, free to the end user technology education that empowers you to do whatever the hell it is that you want to do with technology. Now, do please remember that free to the end user is not actually free. A lot of stuff costs money in order for me to bring you these classes. So if you want to throw some money down into the crowdfunding link down below for a donor box or such, that would be highly appreciated. So anyways, in today's class, we are going to go into patch management. So we've been doing this cybersecurity curriculum for a little while now, and one of the components that many times gets overlooked by many administrators and cybersecurity professionals is simple, basic patch management. Make sure all of your operating systems, all of your apps, all of your mobile devices, and all of your IoT devices are fully updated. When was the last time you thought about updating your HP, networked printer? Have you actually thought about that and verified devices such as your network printers in your environment are actually updated to the current, whatever for software and such? So we are going to be talking about patch management today. Let me put Peanut down and we're going to jump into this class. Okay, so now that Peanut has gone off to do some very important work, let's talk about why patch management is so important. So a lot of times when you walk into a business or an organizational environment, one of the things that has kind of been forgotten about will be updating the systems and the devices within the infrastructure. Many times when I would go into a server room or when I would go into a location, the updates for all of the devices would not be turned on to automatically update, and so many times the systems were out of date by sometimes months or even years. One of the big problems that I saw sometimes, this is an interesting thing to be thinking about, is that the previous administrator would have set up a scheduling routine so that updates would install during a particular schedule, and then for whatever reason that scheduling routine that got screwed up, right? People would turn off their computers instead of leaving them on during the day. People will get the little pop-up box that would say, "Do you want to update your computer now?" And they would say no for years on end, right? And you would run into this problem where basically a lot of the systems would not have their updates. And this is a major headache from a cybersecurity standpoint. And honestly, again, when I talk about cybersecurity, most of the time, cybersecurity is simply good administration. So simply by not having those updates installed on all the client devices or the servers, many times it would be an administrative headache too. Now, one of the things, whenever we talk about cybersecurity, one of the things we hear about is something called a zero-day attack. So basically, hackers find out some vulnerability in the operating system or device or whatever they're going after, and nobody knows about that vulnerability until systems get attacked. Basically, the concept behind a zero-day attack is there were no days of notice before systems started getting attacked. Again, if you are a good administrator, if you have a good cybersecurity policy, even if there are zero-day threats out there, your infrastructure should still be relatively secure. But the reality is many of the attacks against infrastructures simply are not zero-day attacks. The vulnerabilities were known about for months or years. Microsoft or Apple or Adobe came out with patches in order to eliminate the vulnerability months or years ago, and nobody ever bothered actually go around and install the updates onto all of the computers. And so that's one of the interesting things you see in the hacking world, right? Again, you think about hacking, those Zimbabwean hackers on the cutting edge, right? What a lot of people don't think about is there's a lot of hackers out there. They just go and do a little bit of research. They just pull up all these white papers, they pull up all this information, they pull up vulnerabilities that have existed for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then they go after those vulnerabilities because they know many times computers are not properly updated, and so even if a vulnerability had been eliminated because of an update or a patch years ago, there are a lot of systems out there that are still vulnerable. Again, I think about this when I had my store and I had my employees back in the day, again 10 years or so ago. Hackers were going after Java vulnerabilities, but they were going after old Java vulnerabilities. So let's say this was like 2009, 2010, and so the hackers were going after 2003 and 2004 Java vulnerabilities. The reason is because back in the early 2000s, we all thought Java was going to take over the world. Java was going to take over the world. Well, until it didn't. Right? Anyways, so everybody installed Java onto their computers for whatever reason, because apps back in the early 2000s were using Java a lot. And then, Java didn't take over the world, so a lot of people stopped developing for Java. But Java was installed onto these people's systems. And so Java was installed onto the people's systems. They did not have auto update turned on. And so that 2003 version of Java was sitting there. They weren't installing Java apps anymore because Java kind of became blasé. It was no longer the cool thing. And so they would just have this 2003 version of Java just sitting there, absolutely and utterly unupdated for years and years and years and years and years and years. And the hackers figure out, oh, hey, do you know the 2003 version of Java had all of these holes in it? Let's go start attacking that. And then it caused an enormous amount of problems, right? So one of the big things to be thinking about with your patch management solutions and whatever you're going to be doing is just realize that a lot of the hacks and a lot of the attacks against systems are not these cutting-edge zero-day attacks that are sexy and in the news. A lot of these attacks are basically somebody's trying to compromise a vulnerability that everybody knew about 4 or 5 years ago. And so again, this is one thing to realize too, like when we talk about patch management, a lot of people think you have to be absolutely up to date on patch management. Like every single day, as soon as a patch comes out, you absolutely have to have it on your system, which is not necessarily the case. There are some reasons, we'll talk about that later in the class about why you may not want to do that. But again, as long as you have a reasonable schedule for updates, that should be decent for you. One of the other things to be thinking about when we talk about patch management, again, good cybersecurity basically comes down to good administration, is that also one of the things to consider is that a lot of time patches fix problems on computers. So again, in this modern world, that we have, a lot of the vendors have decided, they've come up with this really cool business model where basically they've decided, hey, what if we send out a half-broken product? We charge the customer full price for this half-broken product, and then from the revenue and everything else, we'll get around to fixing this half-broken product, right? And so one of the things with patch management to think about, again, beyond the cybersecurity realm, is that a lot of times, basically, patches fix problems that your users are having with your systems. Again, back when I used to repair computers, one of the big things that I saw is I would sit there, and then again, updating patches, especially back in the day, that would take a long time. Downloading the service packs, downloading a lot of stuff. There's a lot of times where it's like, well, I don't want to go into, installing all of these updates. It's going to take a lot of time, the whole 9 yards. So I'll set the updates to auto run, but I will just sit here and troubleshoot this particular problem and fix this particular problem. And I'd sit there for half an hour trying to fix the problem, and then an hour trying to fix the problem, and then 2 hours trying to fix the problem. And then I get to about the 2 hour mark. I was like, crap, this is taking me a lot longer than I thought it was going to. Well, okay, I guess I'll let the updates run. I guess I'll download these updates, actually update everything, make sure I'm working on a completely updated system, and then once I have that, then I'll go in and troubleshoot more. And then many times I would update the systems. The problems would be solved, right? Again, because basically the vendor sent out a half-broken product from the get-go, and there was no way to really troubleshoot, fix, supposedly, the problems that we were running into. Is basically the fix was actually updating the system. And then the final thing to be thinking about with updates, an important thing, especially in this modern world where we have this service-oriented architecture. With service-oriented architecture, we have software as a service, we have a lot of APIs and that type of thing. one of the things to consider with patch management is a lot of times certain services will not work properly with your systems if they have not been updated to whatever the current version is. Again, in the Microsoft world, it might be the .NET version, right? Basically, the whatever API or whatever you're trying to call to, it needs this version of .NET, and you have a different version of .NET on your system, and therefore until you upgrade into the latest version of .NET, whatever you have going on may not work properly. This can be huge, again, especially in the modern world where you have this whole hybrid infrastructure. You know, you have your local infrastructure, but that communicates with a cloud infrastructure. What if your server, is backing up to the cloud, backing up to AWS Glacier, or backing up to whatever Azure's version of Glacier is? Basically a very inexpensive backup, basically archival storage type thing. Well, in order for that to happen, your system has to be able to communicate with either AWS or Azure. If AWS or Azure requires like a certain level of .NET or something else, and for whatever reason your server hasn't been updated to that latest version, basically the backup routines, right, the off-site backup routines that are supposed to be happening every single night, they may not actually be occurring simply because whatever you have on your server is not up to date, and so cannot communicate with the API as it's supposed to. So these are all the important things you need to be thinking about with patch management. Again, patch management is very important, not just from a cybersecurity standpoint, but also just from a decent systems administration standpoint. Okay, so boys and girls and everybody else out there, can anybody guess what the first step in implementing your patch management strategy should be? If your answer is audit your infrastructure, you will be correct. Again, one of the things when I talk about the cybersecurity, you'll notice a couple of words that I use a lot. One of the words that I use is audit, 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 audit. If you're not auditing your infrastructure, you have no idea what's going on in your infrastructure. So audit, for the love of crikey, audit. And the other thing is relationships. Talk to people, communicate, pretend like your users, wait for it, are actual human beings and interact with them as if they're human beings and try to find out what issues they are actually running into. But the first step that you're going to need to do whenever you're looking at trying to figure out your patch management strategy is to actually audit your infrastructure and verify that what is in your infrastructure is what you actually think is in your infrastructure. Again, when we start talking about patch management is not simply going to be the operating systems. It's not simply going to be the apps installed onto the operating systems, you know, QuickBooks or Office or something like that. But it's also things such as the IoT devices. Again, surveillance cameras. Do you know what network surveillance cameras you have on your infrastructure? Do you know who the vendor of those surveillance cameras are? Do you know when they were installed? Do you know whether or not they've hit end of life? Do you know whether or not the vendor has put out updates and those types of things? That is one thing that you are going to need to try to figure out. Again, things like print servers. So basically with HP or I don't know, whoever the hell you're using at this point, all of your printers at this point have a wired connection that connects them into the network. Now, again, as I've talked about before, anytime you can go to an IP address and you can pull up some kind of web page that gives you information, that means whatever that is has a full-fledged web server built into it. That's essentially a Linux web server that allows you to adjust the configurations for the printer, the surveillance cameras, telephone systems, and the whole 9 yards. But that's a server. That's a server. Just like your Active Directory server is a server, just like your Exchange server is a server, just like your SharePoint server is a server. That printer is, in fact, a server. And if somebody can compromise that somehow, basically get in there or root into it, and then try to attack the rest of your network from there, that could be a major problem. Or again, if you start thinking about this from a hacking standpoint, if somebody can compromise your printer and then actually just simply basically send out whatever goes to this print spooler out to one of their servers, that can be a major problem. Imagine if somebody compromises the printer for your HR department. Imagine every single PDF that your HR department is going to print out. Imagine if that gets copied into the spool on that printer and then basically gets sent out over FTP or something off to a hacker's, FTP drop somewhere. Now, all of the information for employees, all all of the information, all of the information that's supposed to be secure, that all can get copied out very easily. And so one of the things that you need to do is you need to go through and you need to audit your infrastructure so you know what devices are in your infrastructure. So you should know all of the computers, the host computers, the client computers on your infrastructure. You should know all the servers that are in your infrastructure. You should know all the printers on your infrastructure. You should know all the surveillance cameras on your infrastructure. You should know all the voice over IP cameras. A lot of these things, you should know what they are so that you can then go and try to figure out what you need to do for those devices. Again, when we think about things like voice over IP telephones, there's this idea that it's like brand new, right? Voice over IP sounds new and cool and sexy and cutting edge. But the reality is that isn't the case, right? I started installing Cisco Call Manager, those voice over IP SIP phones. Oh, when was that? 2002. You realize how long it's been, right? Think about this. I was installing voice over IP, Cisco quality voice over IP telephone systems and the equipment and all that in 2002. So there is a likelihood, again, especially if you're in a business that's relatively old, your voice over IP phones might be well over a decade old. And again, I want you to think about this. If I talked about somebody's client computer with, Windows 8 or Windows 10 or whatever else, and I said that hadn't been updated in a decade, you'd be like, stupid users. Oh, look at those stupid users. They just never update their systems. That's why users are so stupid. Now, I've got a question for you. How many of your IoT devices on your network have not been updated in a decade? Oh. How many Polycom phones, right? Network Polycom phones do you have on your network that nobody has thought about updating in the last decade? And think about how many vulnerabilities have probably popped up in 10 years that you might want to close those types of holes. So that's one of the reasons you need to go through. You need to audit so that you understand everything on your network, and then you need to try to figure out how those devices are updated, or if they're past end of life. We'll talk about end of life a little bit later, but basically whether or not there are no updates anymore, so essentially that you should replace them. Not only should you be thinking about things such as the printers, the client computers, the servers, and all that, you should also be thinking about your network devices in the modern world. Again, if you're using Netgear, if you're using Ubiquiti, if you're using a lot of these devices, again, that have web GUI interfaces, you go to an IP address, you log in, then you're looking at the port configuration and all that kind of thing. Again, those are web servers. Are they still being updated? If they're not still being updated, then you need to be thinking about how to get them out of your infrastructure. And if they are still being updated, you need to think about actually updating those things. Again, when you think that you sit there and you laugh about it, but when was the last time you actually updated your switches? When was the last time you actually updated your routers? And again, with routers, there's a hell of a lot of vulnerabilities out there. And so if you haven't updated your routers, within at least the last year, that could be a major problem. So the first thing that you're going to need to do is actually audit your infrastructure. Again, using anything from Nmap to any of the products that SolarWinds has or something like that. Use some kind of software auditing to go out there, scan everything on your infrastructure, actually track it down so that you understand what you're dealing with. So now that you've audited your infrastructure and you know all of the devices on your infrastructure, you know what their versions are, you know the last time they were updated, the whole 9 yards, the next thing you need to think about is your update strategy, right? Simply going in and updating everything on your infrastructure is not a good idea. I'm gonna tell you something that might surprise you if you're a noob, but sometimes updates break things. Again, it's kind of one of those sucky things in the real world of technology. A lot of those things that you really need can also do a tremendous amount of damage all at the same time. It's just how it is, right? A lot of time, sometimes Microsoft actually puts out bad updates. There have been a couple of instances of that where you literally install the update Microsoft sent out and it breaks your system, right? So that can be a problem. Other issues that you can run into is simply where sometimes software doesn't work properly. So again, I do a lot of this video editing, live streaming type stuff. I use some specialized software on my computers, and I don't update the operating system until about 6 months after a full operating system has come out because I want to verify that all of the software is going to work properly, right? So sometimes when new updates come out, those new updates have new requirements for the operating system, for the apps that work with the operating system, and all of a sudden, a lot of things can start failing because basically you updated the system. So this is something to consider. One of the other things to be considering is that unfortunately in this modern world, a lot of the vendors like to massively modify their user interfaces for some reason. Now, don't get me wrong, I completely agree with updating a lot of the back-end stuff. I completely agree with updating the stuff that's actually going to make your systems more secure and stable and all that kind of thing. But one of the big issues that you can have is that these companies, right, they get a little bit bored, they want to be cool, they want to be sexy, and so they massively update their user interfaces. Well, the problem is again, even if the software works better, even if the software is more secure, some of the times when you update the user interface, it becomes much more confusing for people to understand what they're supposed to do in a particular product, and that can run you into a lot of problems. So imagine with your help desk, if you update a lot of the operating systems, a lot of the host machines on your network, let's say you update 500 of them, you may get hit with a lot of help desk calls simply because the button that was here is now here. The button that was blue is now green. You click on this button and it used to take you somewhere, but now it takes you somewhere else. And all of a sudden your help desk is getting hammered to high hell and back because the users don't know what the hell to do, right? Their systems are broken. Somebody broke my system last night and I need help. So one of the things that you need to do is you need to be thinking about what is your strategy for doing these updates so that you can limit the strain on your infrastructure. Again, when we talk about cybersecurity, we talk about administration. It is as much an art as it is a science. At the end of the day, all of your systems and all of your devices do need to be updated at the end of the day. It doesn't necessarily mean they need to be all updated within one 24-hour period. So if you have a good rollout strategy for the updates, basically every week a new batch of host computers or devices should be getting updated. You should be verifying everything works properly. And then as it goes, you just keep updating and updating and updating and updating. One of the things you do need to be thinking about when you start pushing out updates in the real world is what will your rollback strategy be? If you push out updates and it crashes things, what happens then? This can be very important with your servers. Again, your Active Directory servers or your Exchange servers. What happens if you push an update onto an Active Directory server and it crashes your Active Directory server? It bricks your Active Directory server. What is your plan at that point in time? So you may have a rollback strategy of, let's say you have an Active Directory cluster. So let's say you have 4 Active Directory servers. They are in a cluster. You update the first Active Directory server. It bricks itself. You pull it offline, you refresh it from a backup or whatever solution that you may have, you then bring it back online, and then you wait a couple of weeks and hope that Microsoft fixes the problem. You then try to re-update the same server again. Hopefully this time it works okay. If it works okay, then you go to the next server. If that works okay, then you go to the next server, then you go to the next server, then you go to the next server. But you need to be thinking about, how do you roll back? Do you have a way of rolling back updates within the operating systems that you're using? Do you have a backup strategy? Do you have a wipe and reload strategy? What are you going to be doing there? And then past that, again, as I've talked about, kind of as I've been talking about this, is you need to be thinking about like grouping computers and updating groups, right? So again, you may be thinking about if your company has different departments. You may have a human resources department and a marketing department and a sales department, so on and so forth. So one of the things that you may want to do is, okay, we are going to update the sales department this week. So all the sales computers, they are going to get updated. to whatever the hell the updates are. You're just gonna sit back, you're gonna wait. Okay, they're all fine. Now let's go over to the marketing department and let's update their systems. Now, when you're thinking about doing an update strategy like this, one of the things that I would argue is you go after the lowest value computers first, right, in order to do the update. So back when I was in the corporate world, we had warehouses. A lot of stuff that I did, we had warehouses, right? So the warehouses had a lot of computers. The cool thing about the warehouse computers is they really weren't used for a hell of a lot. They're basically used for internet, email, and a couple of other things. And so they were one of the lowest value computers in the infrastructure. So if I was going to be doing updates, I might update the warehouse computers first, wait to see if anything happens. If the warehouse computers are fine, then I may go to the marketing department, because marketing usually isn't like, you know, things don't have to be done this second, this minute. They're not going to lose millions of dollars in sales because something's down for a couple hours. Then I might go to the marketing department. Once the marketing department's stable, then I might go to the sales department. That's a little bit more tricky. And then if everything's there is fine, then I may go over and do the HR department, and then finally I'll go to the executives and that type of thing. Now that's one of the things you need to be thinking about, because again, it's how are you going to group these computers, verify that everything is working properly once the patches are installed, and then move on to the next group, the next group, the next group. The same thing is true when you're thinking about your servers, right? Your Active Directory, your Exchange, your IIS, or your web servers, or whatever else. If you're going to be installing updates, install updates onto the lowest value servers first. Again, you may have an IIS server that simply has some kind of internal website for your people. Again, maybe something like a SharePoint server. Maybe your company doesn't use a lot of SharePoint. Like, it's there, it's useful, but it's not really that important. Update your SharePoint server. See how it does. If that's okay, then you might update, one of your Active Directory servers. So that's okay. Update the rest of your Active Directory servers. That's okay. Then you update your Exchange server, right? Think about the strategy that you're going to be using for pushing out these updates. The same is true, again, with things like your surveillance cameras. Again, your surveillance cameras, your telephones, those types of things. One of the problems you may run into is whatever update you install may actually make those devices no longer operate with whatever it is that you have on the network, right? So let's say you have surveillance cameras. The surveillance cameras can be updated, but then they push their video files back to some kind of NAS type device or a network video recorder, something like that. One of the problems that you may run into is that when you update the surveillance cameras, you may push them to a certain level. They now require certain security policies or protocols or something like that. You push them up, and then all of a sudden, they're no longer able to communicate back to the NVR. If you update all of your surveillance cameras at the same time or in rapid succession, you may have a big problem where all of a sudden your surveillance system no longer works. The cameras are updated, they're just not saving data back to the video recorder, so you can have a problem there. Again, your Polycom, your Cisco, or whatever else type of phones you have, one of the problems you may have is that when you update them, the new updates may cause problems with the other things that they're supposed to be interacting with. And so that's one of the reasons you need to basically slowly update everything. Take a couple of video cameras, update them, verify they're working, then do one more. Again, with the telephone systems, with the telephones, update one, update the next, then update the next, verify everything is working properly, understand how you're going to try to roll back if you do need to roll back, and go from there. And so think about the strategy that you're going to be using. Now, when we start updating our systems, the first thing that we're going to need to update is our operating systems. Most likely, if you're in an enterprise environment, you're going to be using Windows, Microsoft operating system, and at this point, you'll be using either Windows 10 or Windows 11. And the nice part is if you're actually in a real business environment, that you can use something called, how do you say this? WSUS, Windows Server Update Service. Absolutely amazing. It's a product that's probably been around almost 15 years at this point, and is one of the things that Microsoft has done very well. Basically, what Windows Server Update Service does is it allows one of your servers in your infrastructure to be able to download all of the Microsoft updates. Basically, it gets cached within that server, and then all of your client computers are able to communicate with that particular server and pull the updates from the server. So this can be very important. Again, this is one of those things you have to be thinking about from as a network administrator, a systems administrator, all that kind of thing. Think about if you have 100 or 1,000 different client systems that are all trying to pull down the latest updates. And the latest updates might be large, right? Might be a 1 gig file, might be a 5 gig file. Now, again, you've probably got decent internet service, so if one of your computers pulls down a 5 gig file, hey, no problem. Hey, we got modern internet, no issues there. Yeah, what happens when 500 of your client computers all try to download a 5 gig file? Again, even if you don't have a bandwidth caps, that's still gonna suck for your network, right? So by using Windows Server Update service, the updates get pulled to the server. So you have one 5 gig file that gets pulled to that server, and then from there, it's distributed locally within your infrastructure. So Windows Server Update service is an absolutely awesome thing. Now, one of the important things to consider if you're gonna be using Windows Server Update service is that all of the client computers do need to be business class machines. Again, this is one of the big problems we might run into with Microsoft and licensing. Is it gets really complicated. I guess Microsoft a long time ago figured out something in the business world. The more complicated they can make something, make a product, the more money they can get out of you, right? If they made the sales process simple, they couldn't get nearly as much money out of you. So they make it a really complicated, convoluted licensing scheme. And again, businesses just keep handing over money. They're like, how much money do you need for this problem to go away? That's really what happens, right? So one of the big problems is, again, you go to Dell or you go to HP or whatever, you buy a computer or the previous IT person bought a computer, they install it on the network, and it works fine, right? It works fine. Printer services work fine, email services work fine, the person can get out to the internet, the whole 9 yards, right? So you go in, you audit the infrastructure, and what you find out is, let's say 25% of the client systems within your infrastructure, they're using a home type operating system. So the home versions of Microsoft don't allow you to connect to Active Directory, and if you're not able to connect to Active Directory, you don't get a lot of the fancy services that come with that full Microsoft stack. So one of the problems that you're going to run into, right, is you're going to have to go and you're going to have the conversation with the CEO where you're like, hey, yeah, so we've got about 100 computers on the network that are home versions. We need to upgrade them to the business class versions. That's gonna cost, $100 or whatever the upgrade license fee currently is. And so I'm just gonna need you to write a $10,000 check. And then the CEO is gonna look at you and go, oh, okay, so what additional are we getting for this $10,000? If I'm spending $10,000 to upgrade these systems, what cool, amazing things are they going to do? And you're going to look at them and be like, well, they're going to update better. It's going to be easier to update. And then you're going to just hate being an IT professional because you're going to get into one of those arguments that you can't lose. Like, that's a horrible thing. Like, as an IT professional, especially when you're worried about cybersecurity, there's these arguments you can't lose. Just because you can't lose them doesn't mean they're easy to have. Like, you just go in there as CEO and you start to have the stupidest argument you've ever had in your life because you need a $10,000 check because these systems are not what they're upgraded to what they're supposed to be. And, in order to be able for everything to work properly, they need to be what they're supposed to be. But these systems were purchased by the last guy. So, anyways, one of those things just to consider. And again, that's why you need to audit. Understand what all the systems look like. Past that, once you start using Windows Server Update service, there's a lot of configurations you can put into Windows Server Update service. Go take some classes on it. It's a cool server. People think I'm snarky about everything. WSUS is something I think is really awesome. But when you go in, there's a couple of configurations. You can either install all updates, all the new updates that come in. You can install critical updates, or you can install what are just the security updates. And so one of the things that you're going to have to consider is what updates do you actually want installed onto all the client computers. Again, Microsoft is unfortunately one of those companies that likes to really screw around with things like user interfaces. So what you would think, with a no-brainer would be is to simply install all updates onto all client computers whenever they come out, just to make sure they're updated and they're up to snuff. But the problem is, if Microsoft screws around with the user interface for something, and all of a sudden you're dealing with the new user interface, help desk is going to hate you. Every single member of the help desk department is going to hate you because they're going to get bombarded with, my computer is broken. What happened to the link? It was on the left side and now it's on the right side. So that's one of the reasons you might not want to install all updates. Again, with critical updates are supposed to be critical, like these are important updates. But again, sometimes important updates can break something else. Do you want to install the critical updates, or do you want to install the security updates, or the basic security things to try to block viruses, to try to block malware, to try to block ransomware, all of those types of things? These are some of the things that you're going to have to consider in your environment. If you do not have only Microsoft client computers in your environment, one of the things you're going to have to be thinking about, if you have Apple, if you have Linux or something like that, you're also going to be having to think about how are you then going to be updating all of those different operating systems too. Again, remember, as an administrator, as a cybersecurity person, you want some kind of centralized control panel. Once you get above like 10 to 20 computers, trying to individually administer all of the computers just becomes almost insurmountable. So it's not something that's going to easily be able to do. So one of the things you're going to need to think about is how are you going to manage all of these different systems from the operating system level. Now, once you patch all of your operating systems, sadly, your day is not done. Your day has basically just begun. It's like 11 o'clock. It'll be a while until you can have lunch yet. The next thing that you need to do is you need to actually go in and you need to make sure that the software is updated on all of your systems. Now, again, this can be a real pain in the modern world because there is an absolute, just tremendous amount of software that users may install onto their systems, and you need to make sure that all of it is updated, right? Any piece of software that is on somebody's computer, especially depending on what security privileges they have on that computer, and that could be a massive vulnerability. Hackers going after Flash. Do you still have, it's in the 2020s now, do you still have Flash installed on your client computers? Hackers can go after QuickBooks. Hackers can go after Adobe Acrobat. Hackers can go after Java, the whole 9 yards. Again, one of the problems you run into in the real world is Adobe Acrobat. It's been around for at least 20 years. And realistically, like the new versions of it do some cool stuff, but not really anything that most people care about. So again, you may have users out there that have a 10-year-old version of Adobe Acrobat installed on their system. That may actually have a number of vulnerabilities. They don't think about it because they simply use Adobe Acrobat. They open a PDF, they take a look at it, they shut it. That's all they care about. So they don't think about actually updating those types of applications. So one of the things you're going to need to do is figure out all the applications that your users are using and then go through and make sure all of those things get updated. Now, depending on the security policies you have for your employees, this can be easier or harder. Again, in the proper cybersecurity world, in the cybersecurity world we all would like to imagine that we're in, basically the users would be locked down so that they can't install whatever the hell they want willy-nilly, and they will only be using IT approved applications. If you're in that environment, updating the apps is relatively easy. You're only given this, you're only given that, you're only given the other thing. We verify all of that software works properly and can be updated, and therefore we're pretty sure that your systems are going to be secure. That's how we would all like it to be. In the real world, though, a lot of times users have far more control over their computers than makes a darn bit of sense, and they can install things willy-nilly. And so one of the things that you're going to have to be thinking about is actually going to the computers. Again, when we talk about auditing, not only can you audit your network, so you can see the operating systems in your devices, you can actually audit all of the computers themselves with all of the different software and everything installed onto those systems. And then when you take a look at that, you're going to need to figure out how you can actually update all of that software and verify whether it should be on the systems and not. Again, when we talk about cybersecurity, when we're doing any one of these things, we should actually be doing multiple things at once, right? Again, like one of the problems with doing classes is I kind of have to compartmentalize stuff. Like in order to teach you a subject, I kind of have to silo that subject and then go to the next silo, the next silo, the next silo. The thing is, in the real world, it's all kind of just mixed together, right? Whenever you're doing something, you're actually doing 5 things at once. And so one of the things to be thinking about too, as a cybersecurity professional, as a network administrator as such within your environment, is looking for things such as pirated software in your infrastructure. Do realize, I don't know what the current fine is, but it used to be something like up to $50,000 per occurrence. a big corporation was using pirated software. So again, one of the big problems we had back in the day is you would have a person in the marketing department, you would have a salesperson, you'd have a secretary, and they needed Adobe Photoshop. Right, Adobe Photoshop, at least back in the day, cost about $600 a pop. So CEOs didn't necessarily want to be like, installing Adobe Photoshop onto everybody's systems. And one of the problems that you would run into is a lot of folks would go out, they would download a torrent of something like Adobe Photoshop, and then they would install it onto their computer. And so one of the big important things with auditing is you need to go through and you need to audit just so you can verify what the users are legitimately using, and then you can actually also go through and see what they're illegitimately using. Does a secretary have a version of Adobe Photoshop on their system? Does your marketing person have Adobe Creative Suite or something like that? Wait a minute, where did this come from? I didn't realize you were authorized to have this particular software. Where did it come from? And again, an important thing from a security standpoint is if they downloaded it from a torrent, they probably got a couple of extra features when they installed it from the torrent. Extra things like remote access tools. Well, we will give you the Adobe Photoshop for free and throw in some rats at the exact same time. Again, your people install this crap directly into your internal infrastructure, and this can be a major problem. So going through, and again, with going through that audit, making sure all the systems have the software that they're supposed to have, coming up with a plan for how to update that software is an important thing, but then you also find problems like that. The other thing you need to be thinking about too, especially in the modern world, is like service agreements or maintenance agreements. So it used to be nice. It was great. Like 10 years ago, I remember the days when you used to buy products. Remember those days? Remember when you used to own your product? You could spend like $1,000 and then you owned it. That doesn't really exist anymore, right? You buy a product and then one way or another you have to pay rent for the product that you already purchased, right? Again, back in the day, you used to spend $1,000, $5,000, $10,000 on a product, and you got all the updates, basically until the new version came out. Again, there was Photoshop 5, then Photoshop 6, then Photoshop 7, then Photoshop 8. So Photoshop 5, you would get all the updates, and they came out with Photoshop 6, then you would upgrade to the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one, right? And the thing now, though, is a lot of the software, they no longer have that versioning like they had before. What they've simply decided to do is charge you a yearly fee, maybe a monthly fee, generally a yearly fee, and for that yearly fee, you get all the new updates, right? So one of the products that I like to use is Wirecast. So whenever I do live streaming, there's this live streaming product called Wirecast. Absolutely awesome. Yes, it cost me $1,000, and yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. The one thing that is frustrating after I spent $1,000, I now have to spend an extra $100 per year to get all of the new updates, right? So again, it's basically just a rolling thing. Instead of having to spend $500 or $800 every few years on the new upgrade, you just spend $100 every year and you get all the new updates. That is something that you're going to need to be thinking about and making sure that the executives have budgeted for the software that the people in your company are using. Again, if you have a marketing department and they use special marketing software, one of the problems that you can run into is that software can run fine, right? It does everything they need it to do. It creates PDFs, it creates vector files, it creates all that kind of stuff. But if they didn't buy the service agreement with it and they're not getting the updates, so everything gets updated, periodically, one of the problems you may run into is though that old software may then actually have vulnerabilities, and that may cause you problems in the future. So the other thing you need to be thinking about with all the individual apps on people's computers is what requires additional service agreements and making sure those service agreements are actually paid for and they're tracked. So those are some things to think about with the software that's installed onto everybody's individual computers. Now, once we've gone past the client computers and the servers, once we've got past the applications that are on those particular devices, the next thing that we need to talk about are the IoT devices. And the IoT devices can be an absolute security nightmare because modern IoT devices generally replace old analog devices that never had to be updated. Again, I used to deal with analog and digital telephone systems, and basically you plug those things in, and they more or less worked for 30 years until you tossed them for your voice over IP systems. Again, surveillance cameras, they basically used analog signals, so the camera themselves were dumb cameras. You fed it power, it gave you an analog video signal back, and so the cool part about surveillance cameras is you install those things, and basically they keep running all the way up until they die. A lot of the old devices that were used in businesses and organizations and enterprises were much like light bulbs, right? Expensive light bulbs, don't get me wrong, expensive light bulbs, but basically a light bulb, right? You configure it, you plug it in, and it keeps doing whatever it's doing all the way until it stops doing whatever it's supposed to do, and then you simply swap it out. Very expensive light bulb. The problem is once we go to the IoT world, we're in an entirely different paradigm. We are no longer in the light bulb paradigm where it just works until it doesn't. Again, we are now in a world where each one of those IoT devices is actually, in fact, a server, right? A less powerful server than your Exchange or your Active Directory server, but a server nonetheless, right? Whenever you can go to an IP address and you get a full web page with login and configurations and all that kind of stuff, that's been being presented to you by a web server. And so an issue that we have in the modern world is many times the IoT devices simply get forgotten about. Right? You plug in all these surveillance cameras, you plug in all these telephones, you plug in access control, you plug in the Nest thermostat or whatever else, and then again, if you have some kind of computerized thermostat, people are used to the old-fashioned electronic thermostats where they just do what they do and that's it, right? Keeps running until it dies, then you replace it. The thing is, if you have a network thermostat or climate control system or something like that, you need to be thinking about how are you going to be updating all of those different IoT devices to make sure that they're on the latest current standards. One of the most painful things with IoT is you're going to have to think about what your refresh cycle is. Have you thought about that for your company? So laptops, right? Laptops, somebody already sat down with the executives and argued about what the refresh cycle for a laptop should be. Whether it's 3 years or 10 years, you most likely have, a lifespan. The company already knows what the lifespan of a laptop should be. Desktops. What is the refresh cycle for laptops? Servers. Again, is it 3 years for a server or 8 years for a server? Anybody with any sense already knows what the refresh cycle for your server should be. You know what people don't think about? What's the refresh cycle for your surveillance cameras? Wait, what do you mean? We spent $50,000 getting all these digital surveillance cameras installed. What do you mean the refresh cycle? Well, they're computerized devices. They get updates just like everything else. Better things come out, more secure things come out, the whole 9 yards. So, have you actually thought what the refresh cycle for all of your IoT devices should be? To be clear, I'm not telling you what that refresh cycle should be, but you need to be thinking about it. Again, we're talking about the cameras, we're talking about the phones, we're talking about the printers. Certain companies continue to update their products for a long time. I like Axis cameras, AXIS cameras, I give them a thumbs up. I like HP printers. I give HP printers a thumbs up. There are other companies out there, they basically, they'll sell the product and then we'll put out like one update for the product just to show what responsible corporations they are, and then they go on to the next products. And so that may be a very big problem for you, right? You install the products, they're brand new. A year later, you install whatever the update is, and now it's been 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years past that, and have you actually been able to update those cameras? And again, when you think about the cameras or any of these IoT devices, remember they are using Linux. They may be using Apache or Nginx as the web server. It's very easy to think these IoT devices are somehow some kind of really fancy, schmancy, cool technology. It's not the same as that normal Linux server that you're dealing with. But the reality is it generally is, right? It's some distribution of Linux using some distributions of Nginx or Apache or something like that. Basically, through that, it's able to write to configuration files, write to storage on that little Linux box, and from from that, it triggers, the hardware or whatever else. These are Linux servers, and as we've seen with Linux, is after the years go by, people find out there's vulnerabilities. Folks didn't realize were there originally, and then folks can start trying to attack those vulnerabilities. That can be a massive problem for you. And so that's something to be considering whenever you're dealing with IoT devices. And it's also important to start thinking about when you go through the purchase process. So when you do go through the refresh cycle, or when you do buy new products, and again, when you're sitting down with the executive, you need to be thinking about how you can do the sales process so that you can get the products that you actually need, right? Let's say D-Link. Let's say D-Link, right? You can install 32 D-Link cameras for, I don't know, $15,000, let's say. It's probably a little low, but you can install, 32 D-Link cameras for $15,000, and you can look at what D-Link's update policy is and decide how comfortable you are with that. Or you go with access cameras, 32 access cameras. That may cost $45,000 to be fully installed, but Access generally has a better, they continue updates much longer than some other companies. And so the overall total cost of ownership, if you're doing things properly, might actually be a lot less with the Access cameras. You get a better quality of camera from the get-go, you get a better user interface, you get a better user experience, and you can actually keep these things in the field, reliable, secure, the whole 9 yards for a longer period of time versus, D-Link maybe, or some other Chinese knockoff camera where it may be a lot less expensive initially, but then you don't know how you're going to be dealing with the security going forward. So these are some of the things to be considered. And again, especially if you sit down and you're going to hire some kind of consulting firm or a contracting firm to install surveillance cameras, one of the things to ask about is, again, what is the ongoing maintenance of these systems? If they look at you like you're stupid, or if they can't give you an answer, don't hire them. Go find somebody that can explain to you, okay, the company's cameras that we're going to be installing, they continue doing updates for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, blase, blase, blase. Make sure that you're comfortable with the overall life cycle of the products that you're going to be deploying into your infrastructure to make sure that they can get updated and all that. The other thing to be considering is there any kind of like centralized update process? Again, cameras, telephone systems are just like client computers and servers. The more you have, the more difficult it is to individually maintain them. So if they have some kind of a centralized system so you can actually, send out updates or whatever else, that's something that you should be looking at when you purchase these types of products. The next thing that you need to be thinking about when we talk about patch management is mobile device updates and BYOD. Bring your own device. Wow. I'm sure the executives love that concept. Wait a minute, you mean the employees, they're gonna buy their own $1,000 flagship phones? We don't have to do that? And then they'll actually be excited they can use it for work? Yay! Here's the problem with BYOD, and here's the problem with a lot of these mobile devices, is many times they do not get updates, much past when the person actually purchases them. Again, I use a lot of Apple products, I use iPhones. One of the reasons I like iPhones is iPhones are supported for a long time, right? Basically, more or less, the iPhone software, the operating system, is going to be supported longer than I will reasonably have that phone, right? 5 years or more. The problem you get to in the Android world is depending on what Android device that you buy, you may never get an update. Like, literally, right? You may buy it and it's fancy and cool and sexy for about the first month that you own it, but then past that, you don't get much of any kind of update. If Samsung doesn't want to update it, or One, or Xiaomi, or HTC, or whatever, they don't want to actually put out updates for their devices, that can cause a major problem. Again, one of the things to be thinking about too with BYOD, you have your users coming into your internal infrastructure with, to be clear, hardware that they own. Now you will notice I get very nasty, I get very snarky, right? I get very whatever whenever we're talking about equipment that the company owns, right? If the company owns it, you should be able to lock that crap down. I have zero sympathy for employees being able to use Facebook on a company computer on company time. Also that, you're getting paid to do your damn job, do your job. But here's one of the issues that you run into. If they actually own that device, they paid $1,000 for that device. It becomes very difficult to become too snarky, to become too self-righteous about what they can or cannot do with that device. And so this is one of the things you need to be thinking about if you're going to have something like a BYOD policy for your company, is this is where you go back to those employee security policies I think I talked about in the first class or the second class, and you need to start thinking about what devices are acceptable as BYOD devices, right? This is something to consider. Like, do you trust Samsung phone? We as a company will support BYOD devices, you know, the Samsung Note phones, the Galaxy Note phones, the HTC, whatever the hell HTC puts out, the iPhones, that type of thing, and actually sit there and figure out what you will support and what you won't support. And then one of the other things to consider is then how are you going to actually do updates for those people's personal devices. Again, when we talk about things like problems, we talk about security issues, when it is a company-owned device, it's very easy to come in, push the employee off the device and go about do your administrative work. One of the things you need to be thinking about is how are you going to be interacting with the employees that are using their own devices. If they, for whatever reason, do not update their devices as often as they should, how is that going to be dealt with? If there are problems with their devices, how is the support system within your company actually going to deal with those things? These are things that you need to consider, and if you're dealing with a BYOD world, this becomes much more an employee HR management issue than it is a strictly IT or security issue, and it's just one of those things. I don't know. Thank God I don't have to deal with it. I will tell you, if you have to deal with BYOD in your infrastructure, I'm glad I'm not you. But this is something that you are going to have to consider. So one of the final things we need to talk about when we're talking about patch management is the whole concept of end of life, right? Executives hate EOL, or end of life, because basically what happens at end of life is you have these products that are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, right? The executives spent a crap ton of money to buy these Windows XP machines, and these Windows XP machines, they're still doing what they're supposed to do. But the problem is Windows XP comes to end of life. Microsoft decides they are no longer going to continue supporting, updates and security and all that kind of stuff on Windows XP. When those updates expire, basically hackers will be able to figure out ways to manipulate that particular operating system. There will be no patches to remedy those problems. And so now all of a sudden you have a hell of a lot of client computers on your infrastructure that are massively, massively, massively vulnerable. So one of the things that you need to be thinking about is when you think about your strategy for patch management and your cybersecurity strategy, you need to be thinking about your end-of-life strategy. Again, normally when we think about servers and when we think about client computers, again, there's this concept of a refresh cycle. So the refresh cycle is everywhere between 3 to 8 years, maybe 10 years, depending on whatever company you're in. Basically, everything just gets flushed out of the system, right? The servers go away, everything else. The hardware gets better, the software gets better, the security gets better. Plus, people like using a computer that was actually built within the last decade. And so there's that normal refresh cycle. But something to be considering is, again, when we talk about your IoT devices, you talk about your printers, like what is the end-of-life policy on your printers? Have you ever considered that? That color LaserJet printer, full duplex, that's been sitting there and churning out prints for the past 15 years. Is it time for that printer to go through a refresh cycle, even though it does everything supposedly that it's supposed to do, but there is a concern about what the security vulnerabilities of that printer may be. This is something that you're going to have to be thinking about. Again, like one of the big problems you can have if you don't have some kind of end-of-life policy or you don't have some type of refresh cycle is we had a client back in the day and their issue was they had a computer that was so old that the version of Unix that they used The company had gone out of business, right? So they had like this 12-year-old server. And basically it shouldn't have been a big deal. Shouldn't have been a big deal. I actually had a Unix expert. I had somebody who knew Unix forward and backward. Their server crashed. And so I was like, okay, pull the data files, reinstall, build a new box, reinstall Unix, whatever else, put the data files back in, and away you go. The problem was, though, is that the hardware that they were using was 12 years old. So you couldn't even buy this crap on eBay anymore, right? So there's no way. It was like the motherboard failed. The motherboard failed. So it was literally impossible to find a new motherboard. And the Unix version that they were using, that version of Unix, literally, the company that developed it was out of business. So there wasn't even a way to buy a new license, right? And so we went through a whole nightmare of trying to get them back a system that actually did something that was useful for them. Again, this is the same kind of problem that you can have with your IoT devices. Again, your telephone systems, your surveillance systems, your access control systems, all this kind of thing. Like, people don't think about that. Like, what happens if your telephone system fails, 12 years after you purchased it? How easy is it for you simply to switch over to a new one? Can you literally just buy a new one, plug it in, and away you go? Or are you going to run into bigger problems? When was the last time updates were created for any of these types of devices? And have you thought about what your end-of-life process is? This is going to be very painful for when you go to your executives, because they don't want to worry about this, right? They spent the money on surveillance cameras, right? Whoever came before you sat there and had a drag-out argument about why the company needed to upgrade to voice over IP or whatever else, right? And so the executive is basically sitting there saying, look, I lost the last argument. I was willing to spend a ridiculous amount of money on all of these voice over IP telephones that basically do the same thing that digital telephones did. But I was willing to lose that argument because I wanted new cutting edge technology. And now you are now telling me I've got to replace all of these devices simply because updates? Why do telephones need updates? Yeah, have fun with that argument. That's something that you should keep in mind, because this is the argument you're going to have pretty soon. Now, when you start actually looking at implementing patch management in a large organizational environment, one of the nice things now is that there is patch management software out there. I remember back in the days when there wasn't. You literally had to sit down at every damn computer and actually update everything. The nice thing is in the 2020s is that there is a lot of patch management software out there. And the great thing is not only will it install the operating system patches, but it will install all of the other patches too. It'll update your Adobe, it'll update your Java, it'll update all of the different applications that you have. The one thing that you do need to look at, though, if you're going to be buying any of this type of patch management software, is to verify it actually updates all of the software you need it to update. So I did a class recently, and I showed you folks a screenshot, and there was one of these pieces of patch management software. That's the thing. It says it updates 850 plus pieces of software. That's awesome. So long as the software that your company is using is one of those 850 plus, right? You see a number like 850 plus, you're like, wow, that must update everything. There's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of pieces of software out there. And one of the things that you have to consider is whatever you're using in your environment may not be in the list. That particular piece of patch management software will actually be able to update. So that's something that you're going to have to consider. Again, one of the things you have to consider too is with your patch management strategy, how are you going to be rolling out patches? And this is one of the cool things in the modern patch management software. You can actually code in a scheduling system so that basically different groups of computers can be upgraded different time periods. Again, where I talked about before, maybe I do the warehouse people first, and then I do the marketing people, and then I do the sales people, and then I do the HR people. One of the cool parts is with a lot of this new patch management software is you can actually just configure all that, right? All of the computers in this particular group, they will be upgraded or updated at a certain period of time, and then if that goes properly, we'll update these, and these go properly, then I'll update these, and these, and these, and these. That's something that may be built in to the update software, the patch management software that you purchase. And so if you go out there and you take a look at patch management software, there's everything for free. there is free patch management software that I wouldn't buy, most likely, for my enterprise. And then it goes up. Might be $25 per agent or license. Usually there's like an agent. An agent is basically an app. It's like a little app that you install onto each individual user's computer, and it goes through it, audits what's on the computer, then it pulls down the updates that it needs. It may be $25 per agent, maybe $50 per agent, maybe more than that. Now I know some new people out there are going to have a heart attack when they talk about $50 per agent. But again, think about how much time and energy that saves. If all of the systems, or most of the systems in your infrastructure, can simply be updated on a managed schedule, you can have rollback and the whole 9 yards, and that's all built in for $50 per computer. That is incredibly inexpensive. But one of the things you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go and you're going to have to do a lot of research. You're going to have to figure out which product works best for you. Again, there's a lot of different patch management solutions out there. So depending on what your environment is your environment heavy in Macs and Apple devices? If it's heavy in Macs and Apple devices, you may go for one product. If it's heavy in Microsoft devices, you may go for one product. If you're actually heavy in Linux devices. You're probably not, but maybe you're heavy in Linux devices. There might be a different product to go for. So this is one of those things, you just have to go out, you have to do research, you have to figure out what the hell your budget is, and then go from there. We'll probably do some classes on actual specific patch management software going into the future, but there's a lot of stuff you can just go, do some research on and see what you think will work for your environment. Now, one of the awesome tools that has been around for at least probably about a decade right now, that is very important in this modern world of the remote workforce, right? In this post-COVID world. Who am I lying? It's not post-COVID. It won't be post-COVID till like 2025. Anyways, in the world past when COVID debuted, the debut of COVID, let's say. A lot of companies are now going to a remote workforce. So one of the big problems you go to when you go to a remote workforce it becomes an ever-loving pain in the ass to make sure that all the preventive maintenance is done on computers that are literally spread all around the world. One of the things a lot of people don't think about, again from the cybersecurity standpoint, is that when we massively change the paradigm for how we're doing, IT infrastructure, that it can change things in weird ways that we're not thinking about, right? When we have cube farms, right? Cube farms are evil for many reasons. Cube farms are horrible for many reasons. One of the reasons a cube farm is good, though, is I, as an IT person, can simply stroll through the cube farm, at will. I can have conversations with people in the cube farm, ask them if they're having any problems. If they're having a problem, I can then turn to the person in the next cube and say, hey, are you having the same problem? And it's kind of easy to understand what's going on with the infrastructure. Again, with management, one of the problems we have with remote workers is how do we do actual leadership management in the modern world? It massively changes, right? In the IT world, how we're going to be dealing with our systems is massively changing too, because we may never actually see that computer, right? A computer may get shipped out to an employee, right? We set it up the first time, we ship it out. That may be the last time we see that computer. Or lordy, if you're dealing with companies where they decide that the employees should have BYOD their own laptops. Again, if they're dealing with coders, if they're dealing with marketing people or salespeople, these people may already have purchased their own equipment anyway. So why should the company spend another $3,000 on a MacBook Pro if these people already have their MacBook Pro? And so one of the issues is when these devices start connecting in with a VPN, especially if you have an old school VPN, a flat network VPN, where as soon as somebody connects to the VPN, they can now see the Active Directory server and the Exchange server, the SharePoint server, and all the clients connected to the systems, the whole 9 yards. That can become a massive problem, because how do you know if the computers are updated properly? How do you know that the user hasn't simply clicked no every time an update has tried to install? So one of the cool things, one of the cool pieces of software that's out there nowadays is something called Endpoint Compliance, and something that you should really be looking at investing in for your company. And what Endpoint Compliance does is generally for VPN services, this is built into Cisco's Anyconnect. So Cisco obviously has VPN services, they have this Anyconnect service, and what it does is whenever somebody tries to connect into your internal infrastructure using their computer, it actually sees what the updates are are on the computer, and if the updates are not to where they're supposed to be, it simply fails out the VPN service. Right? So again, if you have a computer and the operating system hasn't been updated in a year, and the Java is not up to date, right? And those are all massive vulnerabilities, right? You don't necessarily want that computer connecting to your internal network, and those vulnerabilities may be able to help launch an attack against your internal infrastructure. So with Anyconnect or some kind of endpoint compliance software solution, what it does is it analyzes the computer that's trying to connect to the network. If that computer is not up to snuff, it just cuts off the connection, and then you do not have to worry about it so much from a security standpoint. So Endpoint Compliance, if you haven't taken a look at it, it's a really cool thing. Been around a long time at this point, and definitely something you should be thinking about. Again, especially if you're going to this remote work environment for all of your employees. And so there you go. There's a class on patch management. Did you realize somebody could talk this long about patch management? That's my skill. That's my skill. I take something you think you can only talk about for about 5 minutes, and then I just spread that out for like an hour or so. But it's important. Again, do remember what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to give you education. Education is different than simply clicking on a video and watching it until the end, right? Anybody can do that. One of the important things that I'm trying to do here is actually teach you. It may get a little tedious. It may get a little boring. It might be like, la, 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 by the time that I'm at the end. But the point is, I want you to walk away and really understand what is supposed to be going on. If you get done with a 5-minute video, but you don't really remember what was in that 5-minute video, that wasn't education, right? So anyways, again, patch management is a huge thing. So many problems that occur in organizations and different types of infrastructure are simply because the client computers and the servers and the IoT devices simply have not been patched. They're not currently up to date. There are a massive number of vulnerabilities out there, and there's a lot of hackers that simply go after old vulnerabilities. Why spend the time and energy trying to figure out new fancy zero-day attacks when you can simply copy what somebody did 5 years ago? Again, that's one of the things you have to really think about. Like whenever we talk about these Zimbabwean hackers coming in, right? Everybody thinks that they're like special people. Like they're superheroes or super villains of the technology world, right? They're on the cutting edge. But here's the thing about the Zimbabwean hackers. At the end of the day, they're just like all of us. They're just like all of us, right? If they have to work really hard, if they really have to push themselves in order to get a payday, they will. They will work their butts off to figure out how to do some cutting edge attack. If they have to. If they have to. On the other hand, if they can just kind of copy and paste an attack that was created and proven stable 5 years ago and simply target an infrastructure that they know is vulnerable and then sit back to wait for the ransomware attack to be successful so that that company then dumps a couple $1 million in Bitcoin in their wallet, I mean, you know, they have things too. Look, Zimbabwean hackers, right? They have houses, they've got mortgages, they got to mow the lawn, right? Everybody's got to mow the lawn. Cybersecurity people have to mow the lawn. Hackers got to mow the lawn. Everybody has kids. Everybody has spouses. Everybody has to go to whatever their version of church is, right? There is a lot of additional stuff that hackers have to do in their lives other than trying to figure out how to attack your infrastructure. So again, copy and pasting attacks. If it works, if it gets them paid, that is what they'll do. And so that's what a lot of these folks do. They just copy and paste attacks, and then they're absolutely and utterly surprised. And day after day, year after year, the exact same crap continues to work. Really? Hey, Mugabe, yeah. There you go. They just sent us $5 million in Bitcoin. Really? It worked? Yeah, I didn't think it was going to work either, but where do you want to spend this $5 million? Well, the wife wants a really nice vacation. Oh, yeah, great. I think my wife needs a vacation too. Okay, we'll use this money to go on vacation. Anyways, I might cancel it. That's the reality, though. So anyways, again, Make sure all of your client computers are up to date. Make sure all your applications are up to date. Make sure you have a patch management solution that you have some kind of centralized control over. You can verify what's going on. Make sure you go out, you audit your infrastructure so you actually know what's on your infrastructure. Make sure you go and you talk with your users so you understand what your users are actually doing and if they are running into problems. Make sure you create an overall strategy for the patch distribution. Again, don't just throw patches out to every single computer because Microsoft be Microsoft sometimes. If you brick 10 computers, that's a long day. If you brick 1,000 computers, well, you might as well find a new job, right? So anyways, make sure you have a strategy so you slowly roll out the patches over a couple of weeks possibly, and go from there. And again, with the IoT devices, one of the things to be thinking about, again, are you going to be able to update these devices when you initially purchase them, something that seems less expensive in the beginning? Again, if they don't come out with updates in a reasonable amount of time, going for a more expensive product might make a lot more sense. Again, understanding what that end of life is, that Polycom phone, that D-Link camera, whatever else. Do you understand how long they're going to be doing those updates? And then also, again, we start talking about discussions and all that, BYOD. How are you going to verify the BYOD devices are up to stuff? And also, how are you going to win that argument, right? In the modern world, my device, my choice. Again, right? Again, right now we have like this very anti-authoritarian mindset. Nobody wants to be told what to do at all. Not at all. So again, if you're the IT person, if you're the security person, and you have people coming in with the devices that are massively out of date, what is the actual policy? Like simply going to somebody and saying, hey, can you update your device? That might get into a far nastier argument than you think it will. So what is the overall policy? Again, what are the expectations out of the employees? What are the expectations out of the executives? And how do you work within that particular environment? So anyways, those are some things to think about, and that was a class. Again, as I said before, these classes are free to the end user, but they're not actually free per se. Again, all of this stuff costs money. Again, this does not cost a lot of money. That over there, that is off a screen. That's a crap ton of money though. So if you like what I'm doing, again, trying to create authorityless, gatekeeperless, free to the end user, empowering education, if you believe that is something that is good for the world, if you could throw a couple of dollars in, that would be very nice. As always, I enjoyed doing this class and look forward to seeing you on the next one.